"The funny fuse won the battle of the bulge for us," George Patton wrote afterward. An odd line for a man rarely short of credit to claim about equipment he had not designed and barely understood himself. In a signals hut behind the line at Monschau. In the last weeks of December 1944, American intelligence officers paged back through captured radio traffic and prisoner statements trying to explain something that did not fit the record. German infantry caught in the open that month were dying from shells that never touched the ground, and the interrogators kept asking prisoners the same question none of them could answer. Nobody on the receiving end had heard the round land before it went off. Artillery had two ways to kill a man before that December: a direct hit or a timed fuse set in advance to guess when the shell would reach him. Guess wrong by half a second and the burst went 20 feet high and did nothing. Or buried itself in the mud and did nothing just the same. The shells falling on the Germans outside Monschau were doing neither. Every one of them found its own height above the target, with no gunner setting anything and no one watching to correct the fire. That shell had a name inside the army, the VT fuze, for variable time, chosen to mean nothing to anyone who overheard it. It carried its own miniature radio, transmitting and listening off its own nose, and closed the firing circuit. The instant the signal bouncing back said something solid was close enough to matter. It had already been killing enemy aircraft at sea for the better part of 2 years, since a January morning in 1943 off Guadalcanal, when gunners aboard the cruiser Helena brought down a Japanese dive bomber without landing a direct hit on it at all. That shot came almost by accident. A burst thrown up as much in hope as in aim while the plane turned away. Nobody aboard Helena used the word history that day. There was no reason yet for anyone to. The idea began in Britain, in a rough schematic from a radar researcher named Samuel Curran, handed across the Atlantic in the war's first years along with most of Britain's other radar secrets. Turning that schematic into something that could survive being fired out of a gun barrel at thousands of times the force of gravity was the part the British had not solved and the Americans did. The physicist who ran that side of the project was Merle Tuve, and the wartime section he led out of borrowed rooms at the Carnegie Institution took a name built to say nothing, Section T. Its work outgrew those rooms fast enough that Johns Hopkins stood up an entire new laboratory to house it, built around a project its own backers were not yet cleared to name. And by the war's end, Tuve's team had grown from a handful of physicists into more than 1,000 scientists, engineers, and support staff. Some of the Navy's own gunners in the Pacific refused at first to fire the new ammunition, distrustful of a shell built on principles nobody explained to them until a run of visible kills changed their minds. A harder question, arriving from Washington rather than the fleet, did not solve itself so easily. What happens the day one of these lands, unexploded, on ground the enemy holds? A dud fuse pulled from a crater was not like a dud rifle round. Enough of the circuitry usually survived to be taken apart and copied, and German radio engineering, unlike Japan's, had the depth to manage that inside a year. The fear in Washington was specific, not general. A German copy fitted to their own flak would turn every heavy bomber over the Reich into an easier kill. At the one point in the war, when the bomber offensive was the Allies' single sustained pressure on Germany itself. Protecting that shell over Europe had far less to do with the shell than with the men flying over it. What nobody in Washington could confirm at the time was how far behind the Germans already stood. Engineers at Rheinmetall had chased the same idea back into the 1930s, years before Tuve's group existed, and their program had been shelved in 1940, so its people and its budget could go to projects judged more urgent. The fuze that 2 years of American secrecy kept from German hands was, all along, hidden from a research effort that had already given up looking for it. By 1944, Army field guns in the South Pacific were already firing it at Japanese troops. Because Washington judged Japan the least able of the three Axis powers to turn a recovered dud into a working copy in time to matter. Europe answered to a sharper fear, and for most of 2 years the same shell killing Japanese infantry on Pacific Islands stayed off German soldiers entirely. Nobody explained any of this to the crews in France. There was nothing to explain to them. The shipments simply never came. The wall came down in stages, and each stage answered a narrower fear than the one before it. On the 12th of June, 1944, the fuze was released for anti-aircraft use over England itself against the V-1 flying bombs then arriving over London at well over 100 a day, more than 9,000 of them by the end of that August. A dud coming down there landed on English ground, recovered by the people the shell was defending, so the old fear did not hold. Within a month, the fuze accounted for close to 4 out of every 5 V-1s the guns brought down. In September, when the launch sites shifted and the flying bombs started falling on newly captured Antwerp instead, the same logic extended the release to guns defending any ground the Allies now held. And by the war's end, the fuze had accounted for more than 2,000 V-1 kills over that one port alone. On the 25th of October, the combined chiefs of staff went further and approved the fuze for anti-aircraft use over Allied land in general. Field artillery, firing directly at troops instead of aircraft, still sat outside that approval. Nobody in Washington had made that call yet when the Germans attacked on the morning of December 16th. The men holding Monschau that morning belonged to the 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a lightly armed unit built for scouting rather than for stopping a German armored push, and within hours of the first shells landing, the Germans were close to overrunning them. The squadron called for guns. The officer who answered was Colonel George Axelson, commanding the 406th Field Artillery Group, and Axelson had just taken delivery of a stock of the new shells that nobody had told him he could fire. He fired them anyway. Eisenhower had not authorized artillery use of the fuze. The combined chiefs had not authorized it. Axelson had a squadron about to be destroyed in front of him and a stock of shells built for this exact problem. And he made the call that made sense to a colonel standing where he stood that morning. Minutes later, rounds fitted with the VT fuze were bursting over the heads of the German infantry advancing on the town. Nobody court-martialed him for it. None of what the Germans were experiencing had a name yet on their side of the line. Shells that had always needed a lucky guess on the timing dial were suddenly finding an airburst every time at treetop height over men who had done everything the manual told them to do. The standing assumption going into the offensive was that the low cloud and fog blanketing the Ardennes that week would blind Allied observers and keep the guns firing on faith. The new fuze used no observer. It needed no sight of anything at all, and the weather that was supposed to protect the attack never touched it. The attack broke. Word of what one battalion had done under fire reached higher headquarters within days, not because anyone filed a complaint, but because the results were impossible to miss. On the 19th of December, 3 days after the embargo had already been broken in the field, Eisenhower formally asked the combined chiefs for clearance to use the fuze in ground artillery across the entire American line. 2 days later, on the 21st, every restriction on the shell was lifted at once. Army policy had been rewritten to match what one colonel outside Monschau had already done without asking anyone. The army had spent 2 years protecting this shell from the one use that finally decided it, and it took a single colonel's refusal to wait for permission to prove that the waiting was the real risk all along. If that is the kind of institutional history this channel keeps pulling out of the files, the rest of what we have is going up the same way, and subscribing is the simplest way to catch each one as it lands. Patton's own sector got its turn 9 days after Monschau. On the night of December 25th and into the next morning, 3rd Army guns caught a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River near Echternach with a full concentration of the new shells. Patton's own written report to the War Department put the dead at 702. Counted off the ground afterward, his post-war memoir recounting the same action gives the number as 700 flat. Patton never reconciled the two figures, and nothing in the surviving record explains the two-man gap between the account he filed at the time and the one he chose to publish later. What he wrote in both versions was that a shell capable of this would force every army in Europe to rethink how it fought on the ground, once the rest of the world had a copy of its own. The secret Washington spent 2 years guarding from the Germans was not the single secret sitting inside this story. A separate team at Harvard, working for the same research office, had already worked out how to jam the fuze, using a signal that could trigger it from 4,000 feet away instead of 40. That discovery was classified more tightly than the fuze itself, and kept from most of the men who fired it in combat, on the reasoning that a gunner who knew his shell could be fooled might stop trusting it before the enemy worked out the same trick. Section T's own post-war account never explains why the German side never found the same fix, only that they never did. The cruiser that fired the first combat shot of all this, Helena, did not live to see any of it. She went down at Kula Gulf the following summer, 5 months after her gunners brought down a dive bomber they never technically hit, in a fight that had nothing to do with fuses at all. The Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, later said the device had helped blaze the trail to Japan. That was true enough of the Pacific War. It said nothing about the 2 years the fuse spent locked out of the one theater where a single artillery colonel decided the lock was his to break. By the time the war in Europe ended, the shell the army had refused to risk over enemy soil for nearly 2 years was standard ammunition in every battalion still firing it, requested by name rather than issued as an afterthought. The restriction that shaped that decision for most of the war lasted, in the end, no longer than it took one artillery colonel outside Monschau to decide the weight itself was the greater danger, and 5 days for Washington's own paperwork to agree with him. Nobody went back afterward and rewrote the record to make the embargo look like the correct call it was supposed to have been all along.